right, it's been way too long. We're going to do some recording today. We're painting with gouache. So let's get over to the drawing table and paint with some gouache. Gouache. It's fun to say. Gouache. Well, so here we are over at the drawing table, and I had this whole grand conversation for over an hour about what I was doing and how I felt about it. We're all about the feelings around here. And I realized that I had multiple cameras with audio sources that were active. So there was like this tremendous echo. It was super annoying. I was going to put a full length video out there for my Patreon subscribers, but instead, we're all going to watch this time lapse video together. That's okay. It's going to be amazing because I kind of already have been through this and it's like looking back in time. So today we're painting one of my characters from my project, Realm of Thraul. If you're interested, it's a fantasy world that was created around the suits in a deck of playing cards. This particular character is the King of Clubs, who's been exiled from his people, and he's trying to make his way back without everyone killing him. He was exiled by his wife, the Queen of Clubs. So you'll have to read about that story if you're interested in that. But we're painting with gouache, and gouache, as you can see, this mess that I have laid out in front of me. I have a butcher tray, and in the butcher tray, I laid down a piece of parchment paper, like baking parchment. And over that, we have some shop towels, which I saturated with water. And then I put those tiny little tubes of paint onto the wet paper towel. And gouache is an interesting media. I don't have a ton of experience, so everything that I say about it, take with a grain of salt. But I laid down a little bit of a watercolor wash, and I'm painting the gouache on top of that. And gouache, unlike watercolor, is opaque, so you can paint with layers, and it can actually be reactivated. So if you add water to it, it could become liquid again. So it kind of dries in a semi-chalky kind of manner, but it's a nice bridge between what I would say is a nice bridge between drawing and painting, or drawing and in particular oil painting, because I think it's more forgiving than watercolor. It's a little less intimidating than oil. And what I'm doing here is working with a tiling system. So a tiling system, kind of like if you remember back in the day painting paint by numbers. A paint by numbers was they gave you these little numbers and these little tubes of paint, which were the crappiest paint you could ever imagine painting with even crappier brushes. But the concept of the paint by number was genius, because laying down the color and value next to each other, laying those tiles down next to each other, is really the basis for all painting. So rendering a form by turning it, by changing that value, by adding a lighter or darker, or changing the temperature, or changing the color, is basically what I'm doing here. So these little areas, I'm pre-mixing the color. The palette is on the top on the left there, and you can see the colors that I'm using. And then what I'm doing is adding a little water to that and taking it over onto that metal tin on the bottom of your screen, and actually mixing up puddles of color. So painting with gouache, I don't have a ton of experience with it. I've only painted with it for probably 15 hours maybe in total, 15, 20 hours worth of experience with it. Obviously, I've painted with other materials before, but it has a certain familiarity to it, and it also it's sort of user friendly. It's difficult to explain, but I find it a way to kind of, again, bridge that gap between drawing and oil painting, which I think oil painting is ultimately a bit scary for many people. So the process, I'm only kind of reviewing part of it here. I have drawn the character with pencil. So I use graphite pencil on an illustration board. It's a piece of illustration board. I rendered it pretty. I did a pretty fair amount of detail. So I'll include. I think I took a picture of it. I drew it with pencil, and then I fixed it with a bit of workable fixative. So I think I flashed that on the screen there. The workable fixative is a spray that's going to take that graphite and adhere it to that surface so that when you do start to add water and paint over the top of the pencil, it just doesn't turn into a big, ugly mess of mud and graphite and water and pencil or water. Gouache in this case. Then what I did after fixing it is I put some watercolor down, and the watercolor is those sort of like drippy blue puddles and purple little transitions that are going on around the outside of the portrait, and that kind of gave me a little bit of a base. It sort of gave me so I'm not really painting on a whiteboard, and I just kind of had fun with that. That was really free. I was just kind of pouring paint on there and splashing paint on there and letting it become its own thing, which is a really nice way to start a project like this. So you're not all tightened up and thinking, oh, I gotta make this perfect. You sort of ruin it, and then you kind of fish the image back out of the mess that you've created. Now, watercolor is very unforgiving. That's why I don't particularly like watercolor. I never have. I have pretty limited experience with that too. But I feel like with watercolor, you have to have a plan. You have to have there's a certain methods that work and certain methods that don't work. You can never. It's transparent, so you can't get back to white, which is always a problem for me. Um, and I feel like if I tried watercolor again, I might like it more. But as it stands right now, I'm not a big fan. But gouache, on the other hand, I am. I have become a really big fan of gouache because it is forgiving and it is opaque. So you can paint over, you can reactivate it, you can make mistakes and go back and fix them. You can experiment. It seems very, very much free to me, where you can kind of try something, and if it doesn't work, you haven't ruined a painting. I think with other media, it's a little bit less forgiving than this particular gouache. So again, I've used it. I've heard of it. It's been around for a really long time, but I hadn't used it until I started taking some courses at Watts Atelier, which I've talked about on this channel quite a bit in the past. So I did some classes there, and I started to pick up gouache and mess around with that with the instruction that was provided. And I kind of took to it right away. I felt like it was just fun. It was kind of free. The cleanup isn't extensive because it's a water-based material. You can kind of pick it up, walk away from it, come back to it, spend half an hour. You really can't do that with oil. You can't sit down and work on an oil painting for 20 minutes or an hour. You need a larger block of time just because of the nature of that material. So I do like the immediacy of it. I like the fact that you get something right away. I like the fact that it's forgiving and you can work back into it. Um, I did have a little bit of a problem with my camera. I don't know what's going on with that, but once in a while it will just cut out. Super annoying. I don't know what's going on with that, but the whole video situation is that's a whole nother story for a whole nother video. But as I'm working through the character here, I'm working from larger sections to smaller sections. I'm applying more contrast and more detail as I work through it. So I'm not starting out going right into I'm going to go ahead and paint the eyes, or I'm going to go ahead and paint those little tiny hairs. I'm kind of gradually working my way into it. I'm increasing the contrast as I go. I'm increasing the amount of value, the amount of texture. And what it's kind of weird. I wonder if this video like it feels like it restarted. Okay, there it didn't. That's super weird. I feel like I've seen this before. Didn't we already see this where I put in some of this? I don't know. Maybe I'm losing my mind as I'm watching myself paint here and fast forward. It would actually be really cool if you could paint that fast. Imagine the amount of work you would be able to get done in one lifetime. But part of the idea, or part of the one of the advantage of gouache, I think, is the fact that it's really fast. So I think that illustrators made use of this back in the day when they couldn't really afford to spend the amount of time it requires to make an oil painting, but they wanted something that had a similar kind of look to it. I think gouache was probably one of those go-to media, so that you can get something done in a fraction of the time. That the drying time wasn't as significant, the waiting time wasn't as significant. So back to my experience with gouache. So watching the instructor Jeff Watts paint with gouache, and then thinking, I'll go ahead and give this a try. It's become quickly, like, again, I haven't really been using it that long, but it's quickly become one of my favorite ways to work. It's nice to take a break from digital, or shorten the time that you have to work on an oil painting. The purpose of this particular painting is I'm doing studies of all the characters from the stories. I've already done full out paintings, and you can see these characters if you check out the project. And I also have decks of cards available, which I made a video on this channel about the decks that I had printed. And on the face cards, you get all of these characters. So this particular character I've painted several times, I've drawn several times, which is probably why this went so quickly. I think there's a lot less calculating and a lot less thinking that have to go into something after you've kind of become really familiar with it. Eventually, I'm going to frame all of these gouache paintings and sell the originals. I don't know if I'm ready to do that yet, because again, the purpose of these is really just a study. But if people become interested in those originals, I think over time I will decide to sell them. Another thing to note here is when I'm painting with gouache, I really don't change brushes very frequently. I think I did this entire painting with 2 brushes. And here you could actually see me applying a little bit of new paint and water to the surface. I ran out of white there. So you saw I took that jar and poured some of the water on there to saturate the tile, and then put the paint on it. It just keeps it moving. It keeps it liquid a little longer, even though you could reactivate it. I like painting with the fresh paint out of the little tiny tubes. And again, you could also note how small those tubes are of gouache. You do not need a lot of this to get it going. Very little bit goes a long way when it comes to this, especially because when you add water to it, it does act as a watercolor. It's very similar to watercolor. I don't know exactly what the makeup of the paint is, but it plays really nicely with watercolor, which is why I'm able to paint watercolor under the gouache and then go into the gouache and reactivate the gouache and go back and forth. Also, one of the things that I didn't get into in this particular video is that you can go on top of this with Prismacolor colored pencils as well. So if you are trying to get like really fine detail, or you want to add some texture, hatching, something that you really can get a lot easier and a lot faster with a dry medium, you can use Prismacolor colored pencils right over the top of the gouache, or the watercolor for that matter. That's one of the ways that one of my favorite artists that I follow, Drew Struzan, the one that Drew Struzan is known for doing movie posters. He airbrushed with acrylic or watercolor or gouache, and then put colored pencil, Prismacolor colored pencil over the top of it, which just has a really really cool look. And his style has been emulated many times over the years because he was the best at doing that, and people kind of followed in his footsteps. So here you can see I'm adding little bits of detail again. I didn't really get into that until much later in the painting, where I'm kind of adding the final touches and little hairs and little highlights and whatnot. So that is basically gouache in a nutshell. So yeah, it had been too long since I had made a video, so I figured why not turn the cameras on and do a little chat. And unfortunately, the words that I said are lost to the technology difficulty because of the echo. But I appreciate you taking the time to check out the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. You got something out of it. Make sure you comment if you have any questions or about the process, or anything in general. So thanks again, and take care.
Thanks for watching. There's a little button that they put on the laptop or something, and then they say click it, and then you can never even miss a video.
That's if you subscribe.